Now I want to set the historical background before I get to Herod. I'm going to telescope about 1,000 years of history within a few paragraphs of narrative, because there's a lot of confusion as to the origins of the Jewish people. The founding myth of the Jewish people is their origin with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the patriarchs, the captivity as slaves in Egypt, and the exodus from Egypt under Moses, with Joshua leading the conquest of the land of Canaan, the promised land, which is roughly the land of Israel and Palestine in modern times. When I use the word myth, it's not to say that this is completely untrue, but that most of this biblical story to this point has little or no corroborating evidence. The Jewish story becomes more historical with a firmer basis in fact with the Hebrew confederation of 12 tribes, loosely connected by worship of the same God of Israel and speaking the same Hebrew language, but sometimes maybe even warring on each other. The tribes are unified into a single kingdom, first ruled over by Saul, who is succeeded by David, and then his son Solomon. David captures the city of Jerusalem and makes it his capital. Solomon built the great temple in Jerusalem, which becomes the center of the Israelite religion, with 3 annual pilgrimage holidays to the temple, and worship basically through the prescribed sacrifices of animals and offerings of grain. After Solomon, the United Kingdom splits apart into North and South. The Northern Kingdom, known either as Samaria or Israel, is supported by 10 tribes. The Southern Kingdom remains loyal to the house of David from the tribe of Judah and is supported by the tribe of Benjamin and is centered around and retains control over Jerusalem. If you read the Bible, the books of Kings, Samuel, and the prophets in the Bible, you get a rough idea of what was going on, except you also get a sense that these books are court histories, serving the agendas of certain individuals and interests. So these are not modern histories, but they can make for some lively reading. During the 8th century before the Common Era, the kingdom of Samaria was conquered and destroyed by the Assyrians, in other words, the northern kingdom. The 10 tribes disappear from history, except in legend. There is a legend, for example, that the Pashtun people of Afghanistan and Pakistan have Israelite ancestry. In other words, the Taliban, if you can believe that. Another has the so-called 10 lost tribes becoming the indigenous tribes of the Americas. Even more fantastical, I think. About 150 years later, Jerusalem and the southern kingdom of Judah fall to the Babylonians. Actually, these people were the Chaldeans. Sometimes they're referred to as the Neo-Babylonians. Survivors are led into captivity in Mesopotamia, but 10 years later, the Persians destroy the Babylonian Empire, and King Cyrus of Persia allows the Jews to return to Judah, which becomes known to us as Judea. Also at this point, we can legitimately refer to these people as Jews rather than Hebrews or Israelites, the word Jew is derived from Judah and Judea. Properly speaking, the Hebrews of the northern kingdom, now defunct, were not Jews. The Jews return and rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, renewing the rites of sacrifice in the temple, overseen by the priestly caste and the Levites. They are no longer speaking Hebrew in everyday life, but rather Aramaic, also a Semitic language, which they picked up while in exile in Babylonia. A couple of centuries later, Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire, and with his sudden death, that is Alexander's sudden death, his conquests are divided up among his leading generals. Judea and its environs are fought over and variously conquered by the Ptolemies ruling over Egypt and the Seleucids ruling over Syria. Ultimately, it falls to the Seleucids. In short order, the Seleucid ruler Antiochus attempts to remake Judaism into a polytheistic Greek-influenced religion, conforming with the newly dominant Greek culture. A rebel army arises in the Judean countryside, led by the Hasmonean family, a priestly clan. Over a period of decades and many ups and downs, the Hasmoneans free Judea of foreign rule and establish themselves as the ruling family in Jerusalem. Their rule is violent and brutal, and for the only known time in Jewish history, they conquer and convert neighboring nations by force. The most consequential of these conquests was of the Idumeans, also known as Edomites, related to the Arab Nabatean people. The Idumeans were given the choice of either adapting Judaism or being forced into exile. Most decide to become Jewish. The Hasmoneans ruled as independent monarchs from the years 140 to 63 before the Common Era, when the Roman general Pompey captured Jerusalem while intervening in a civil war. Now we get to Herod the Great and his progeny. Herod's family is Jewish because his grandfather was a converted Idumean. His father, Antipater, was a high-ranking official under the Hasmonean ruler Hyrcanus II. Antipater rose to prominence by being loyal to Julius Caesar, serving Rome as governor of the Galilee. Herod was born around 72 before the Common Era. As a young man, he cultivated close relations with the Roman governor of Syria, who made him general in Samaria, and an area that's probably southern Lebanon today. Herod marries into the Hasmonean family and murders his way onto the throne, eventually wiping out the entire Hasmonean family, including his wife, Miriamne. Because he probably suffered from paranoid schizophrenia or some such mental illness. He overthrew the Hasmonean king Antigonus II in a 3-year war between 37 and 34 before the Common Era. He was granted the title of King of Judea by the Roman Senate and ruled under Roman overlordship until his death around 4 BCE, although the exact year of his death is not really known. He passed on the throne to his sons, establishing his own Herodian dynasty. He successfully maneuvered his way through the sharp divisions of Roman politics, going from being an ally of Mark Antony and Cleopatra to cultivating Antony's former ally, who became his enemy, Octavian. Octavian then became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. After Octavian's forces defeated Antony and Cleopatra, Herod rushed to meet with Octavian on the island of Rhodes, groveling before him and artfully convincing Octavian that he'd be loyal to him. Regarding him as an effective ruler who would be useful to defend Roman interests, Augustus let him both live and remain the vassal king over Judea and most of the neighboring territories. As such, Herod had virtually unlimited power within his kingdom, but no independence in foreign relations, which were entirely determined by Rome. Herod figures in the Christian Bible with the murder of the innocents and Jesus being safeguarded as a baby. But like with the Exodus story in the Hebrew Bible, there's no historical evidence that this ever happened. Aside from his brutality, Herod is remembered historically for his ambitious array of building projects. Most significant was his renovation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. I think there's a second temple slide. That's the next one. Doubling its size. This is an actual model, which is in Israel today. You see in the forefront, with those open spaces there, the courtyards. That's the temple from Herodian times. So there's a second temple. He also oversaw the construction of a port at what's called Caesarea Maritima, usually just referred to as Caesarea nowadays, and a number of fortresses, including at Masada and Herodium. And also the enclosure around the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron. Hebron is actually the second most holy site in Judaism historically, where the patriarchs and matriarchs are supposed to be buried. Upon Herod's death, Augustus recognized Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, as ethnarch of Judea, Samaria, and Idumea until the year 6 of the Common Era. But then he judged Archelaus incompetent to rule, and he removed him from power, combining the provinces of Samaria, Judea, and Idumea into a single province. This enlarged province was ruled by the Roman prefect, until 41 of the Common Era. Herod Antipas was tetrarch of Galilee and Perea from Herod's death to 39 CE, when he was deposed and exiled. Philip became tetrarch of territories north and east of the Jordan, where he ruled until his death in 34 CE. Descendants of Herod the Great mostly ruled as vassal kings on the edges of Palestine, except for Herod Agrippa Herod Agrippa I, who briefly ruled over Judea from 41 to 44 of the Common Era. As of 65 of the Common Era, on the eve of the first Jewish revolt, Herod Agrippa II, the son of Herod Agrippa I, and a great-grandson of Herod the Great, ruled territories inhabited by a mixed population of Jews and non-Jews, people of Greek culture. The only names of these territories that would be familiar to us in our day are the Eastern Galilee and the Golan Heights. In other words, these are territories that was ruled by Herod Agrippa II, who plays a role in the story I will continue to tell. The Jewish rebellions against Rome have long fascinated me for their ferocity, for the great victories initially won by the Jews against the greatest empire of the ancient world at the height of its power. And I've long wondered if the Jews somehow could have managed to win, or if they could have been more prudent and avoided the massive destruction of the Jewish homeland, and what this might have meant for the Jewish people if history had turned out differently. The Jewish population of the Roman Empire in the first century of the Common Era was much larger in proportion than at any time in history. It is estimated at 7 to 8 million, which was about anywhere from 6 to 9% of the population of the Roman Empire. In times and places, their existence was very normal and accepted in the diverse population of the Greco-Roman world where they lived. But other times it was not. For example, the Jews were first expelled from Italy in 19 of the Common Era, but paradoxically, many were also conscripted into the Roman army. The Emperor Claudius shut down the synagogues in Italy and repeated an expulsion order in 48 of the Common Era. But the concentration of Jews in the wider Middle East, which you see here, especially Syria, where Jews numbered about 20% of the population, gave the Jews a certain power politically. Also, upper-class Jews traditionally allied themselves with the Roman order, fearing the demands of the peasants and other lower classes, whether Jews or non-Jews. The traditional rabbinical explanation for the loss of the Jewish homeland, especially in the wars against Rome, is sinat chinam, Hebrew for causeless hatred.
So I guess one of the questions I have, going back to the temple, and then maybe something you can clarify from me. So it does look very open spaced, and it looks very glamorous. And I've looked at a lot of the Christian Jewish websites. It shows very grandiose temple. But to me, I would assume since the city was so busy, you will have extremely busy kind of place. Like it shows an open courtyard. I understand there's like an ark and all that stuff, but to me, it doesn't look like a busy place. So do you think that a lot of the depictions of the temple as a replica is more like a hearsay than anything? Or is it exactly how Josephus Flavius had portrayed it, and therefore not showing it being a busy place and therefore a little more congested in that regard?
Look. During the three pilgrimage holidays, it was extremely busy because a huge amount of the population came from the countryside to Jerusalem as a religious obligation. So it would have been quite a throng. Let's see. We had. Can you show which would be the Wailing Wall of the Second Temple? No, I don't know what the orientation of this is. I don't know what direction it's showing, so I can't. It's the Western Wall. The so-called Wailing Wall was a remnant of the Western Wall. So I honestly can't say which of these sides would be analogous to where the Western Wall would be.
Right.
Sorry.
There's another question: is why were the early Jews hated?
Well, that's always a hard question. The Jews had a religious tradition which was quite different than what other peoples had at that time. Judaism was monotheistic, and no other people at the time in the ancient world believed in just one God. So that would make them kind of suspicious. They also had strictures in diet and behavior, like the laws of kashrut, of eating food that's considered kosher, which has to do with a certain way of slaughtering animals for meat. You're not supposed to be drinking the blood of the animal. You're also not supposed to mix dairy and meat. The Jews had a certain, from the point of view of other people, the Jews had a certain baggage of these rules and regulations, which other people didn't understand and didn't appreciate. Somebody's raising a hand here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me.
Kathy Langham.
Okay, let me see if I can unmute her. I apologize, Kathy. Okay, I see that. Okay, so Kathy, I just asked to unmute you. You can unmute and ask a question. Oops, sorry again. Ask to unmute again. Go ahead, Kathy.
Okay. All right. I have a question about, exactly what you're talking about right now. It's always been my sense that the Jews were consistently hated down through the centuries because of their refusal to assimilate to the dominant cultures, and that refusal to assimilate was the result of their religious constriction. Would you say that that's a big piece of it?
That's a piece of it, except that it doesn't explain more modern, anti-Semitism in more modern times when Jews, in fact, did assimilate, and yet, modern racial form of anti-Semitism arose,
Mhm.
which looked at Jews as a foreign implant, even if Jews had lived in a particular country for centuries. In some cases, like in the Middle East, Jews predated Muslim populations in what is now Iraq, for example, in Mesopotamia, by centuries. Yet, it's a question of you get.
I guess I'm not talking about modern day anti-Semitism, but what my sense is that historically this was a problem for Jews, was that
right to remain a Jew, one had to conform to Jewish customs and law,
right,
which were not the customs and law of the majority in a particular place.
right.
But the Middle East in Greco-Roman times was quite diverse. But there was a prevailing Greco-Roman norm. There was, for example, the upper classes, they practiced gymnastics in the nude, and the Jews, were not inclined to do that.
Mhm.
Now, a lot of the conflict which came about in Hasmonean times prior to Herod, and even during the conflicts with Rome, these were conflicts between Jews who wanted to assimilate and Jews who did not. And also there were efforts to assimilate to varying degrees. Like you could assimilate in the sense of learning to speak Greek and be conversant in Greek literature, but you still want to hold on to your religion. And there were Jews who basically wanted to turn Judaism into another kind of pagan religion, where the God of Israel was not the only God that you can worship. So a lot of the conflict you see among Jews has to do with how they interpret the ancient religion and how loyal they want to be to it.
Ralph, can I just add a couple more things
Sure.
as far as writing is concerned? So if anybody read Josephus Flavius, one of his writing actually is trying to explain the Jewish laws and traditions to non-Jews. The kashrut law, particularly, why do we slaughter cattle, in that regard. And his writing is actually written, it says, against Appian. Appian was a Greek writer who, not understanding the Jewish rules and kashrut laws, and particularly or way of the dietary positions, completely dismissed the Judaism and wrote, and that actually his writing didn't survive. He was a Greek writer in Egypt who wrote against the Jews, and the Josephus Flavius, who lived several centuries later, had actually a writing to write against the Appian, what, and trying to explain. But just in and I'm sure Ralph is going to explain. Josephus Flavius, the reason he knew about this actually was a pious a Jew who followed all the Jewish religion, even though most of the Jews today consider him to be a traitor, which probably I'm sure Ralph will get into it. But he did it.
Yes. What you're referring to as Joseph, I refer to him as Josephus.
Right.
That you're giving him his Roman name.
Right.
And he becomes an important figure, not only as a chronicler and an explainer for Judaism, but also as an actual actor during the Jewish revolt, because he was a Jewish general. All right, to backtrack a little bit, as I said, the traditional Jewish explanation for the loss of the Jewish homeland is this notion of sinat chinam, of causeless hatred. And this relates to what I was talking about in terms of Jews being at each other's throats about, whether to conform, to assimilate, which is another word, or to assert their Jewishness, and how you define that Jewishness. And now I'll speak at the spark of this revolt. Judea and its environs were ruled by a Roman procurator overseen by the governor of Syria. And the governor of Syria commanded one of Rome's strongest armies. In the year 65 of the Common Era, the new procurator, Gessius Florus, was unpopular in Judea, but most of his predecessors were also unpopular, if not all of them. Tensions and violence often simmered and sometimes erupted between Jews and Greeks, or between Jews and Samaritans, and often against Roman authorities. Usually because these authorities might have done something to defile the temple with graven images, or their demands for excessive tax levies. What triggered the rebellion in 66 of the Common Era, the very next year, was a decree by the same procurator Florus to impose a 102,000 denarii tax, 102,000 dinar tax from the treasury of the Holy Temple to be collected, quote, for Caesar's needs. In other words, for the emperor. This probably had to do with a drop in expected revenues to imperial coffers in the region owing to a possible tax strike. Jews and other people who were unhappy with, the Roman order against them often resisted via tax strikes. In May of 66, Florus led an army into Jerusalem to collect that money from the temple by force. Rioting broke out against this show of force, and Florus compounded the crisis by ordering his troops to strike down people at will. Others he summarily tried and executed by crucifixion. Jewish notables and priests tried to reason with both sides for the Romans to withdraw and the mob to disperse. but to no avail. At one point, Roman soldiers charged into the crowd, causing a panic, which killed many people in the crush of a stampede. At this point, tens of thousands of people attacked the Romans at every turn, causing Florus to negotiate a retreat by most of his force, while leaving behind a token garrison of 500. This was a nationalist rebellion that was also a social revolution. During the summer of the same year, the Jewish king, Herod Agrippa II, whom I mentioned before, allied with elements of Jerusalem's upper classes, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, and the Sadducean priestly ruling faction to put down the revolt. A mix of royal mercenary troops and aristocratic militiamen seized the upper city and faced off against the revolutionaries. After a week, I have to switch glasses. After a week, the revolutionaries were reinforced by pilgrims and zealot forces from outside of Jerusalem to overwhelm the counter-revolutionaries. Many of the counter-revolutionaries fled the city in underground passageways. The royal palace remained in counter-revolutionary hands, but not for long. A fresh force of zealot fighters arrived under Menachem of Galilee, a veteran revolutionary who knew military tactics. His faction has seized control of the Herodian fortress of Masada and arrived with fresh stocks of arms taken from the fortress. The Jewish defenders of the palace negotiated safe passage to retreat, but this did not include the Roman garrison. And the high priest Ananias, the counter-revolutionary leader, was killed. Still, there was a moderate faction of property owners who distrusted the zealot social revolutionaries, who had a class interest that opposed the debt cancellation rhetoric of the zealots. The zealots, by the way, that's the name of the faction. This was the revolutionary faction, the zealots. So the more moderate faction who took over the revolutionary forces, they had an opposed class interest to the zealots. The zealots were in favor of debt cancellation, for example, echoing the biblical laws regarding the sabbatical and jubilee years. The jubilee year, by the way, I know involves a total cancellation of debt. I'm not sure about the sabbatical years. We've lost track of when the jubilee year should be, but in Israel they still observe the sabbatical year, and in fact, I think either this year or this past year were sabbatical years. The primary thing that happens in Israel today during the sabbatical year is that farmers who follow this law will allow their field to go fallow, fallow for a year. It's good for agriculture. Anyway, this more moderate group of upper class property owners became the new leadership within Jerusalem. And in September 66, they launched a surprise attack against Menachem's zealots, killing many or most, including Menachem himself. Most of the survivors fled back to Masada. A powerful Roman army of 30,000 legionnaires, auxiliaries, and allies, including soldiers of Herod Agrippa II, the Jewish king, marched to crush the revolt. Astonishingly, this army failed to retake Jerusalem and was forced to retreat, suffering a terrible ambush as they retreated at Beit Horon, the same narrow pass where the Maccabees had won a great victory over the Syrian Greeks about 200 years before. I think if you go back to the first slide, that the map that's on the right here, this is actually taken from the time of the Hasmoneans, and you see Jerusalem in the middle, and you see Beit Horon. The Romans and their allies were retreating toward the coast, and they had to go through Beit Horon, this particular pass, and that's where they lost something like 5,000 soldiers. A Jewish aristocrat known to us as Josephus was dispatched by this new, more moderate revolutionary government in Jerusalem to defend the Galilee, the north of the country, against a new Roman offensive that they knew would come. Josephus fortified several strongholds against the Romans, but before facing them, Josephus came to blows with these same kind of radical Jewish forces on the one hand, and he also contended with other wealthy Jews who desperately wanted to patch things up with Rome. In fact, he lost one of his best strongholds, Tiberias, because leading Jews in that city conspired with the Romans and happily opened their gates without a fight. Josephus's great stand was at a place called Jotapata. In Hebrew, it was called Yotfat. His army resisted brilliantly, repulsing the Romans under their general Vespasian at least twice before the Romans found their way in by stealth. I'll describe some of this. Now, the Romans employed these siege engines. I mean, they're called engines because they moved on wheels. And one kind of engine was kind of like a ramp. Well, it was a ramp where, you could have soldiers go up and scale the walls of a city that you're attacking. Another would be like a big tower, and the tower would tower over the walls, and you'd have archers who would fire into the city. Now, brilliantly, Josephus's army were able to defeat these siege engines by building on top of the walls that actually existed, building their walls up to the point where they were at a higher elevation than the siege engines. But as I said, they got through by stealth. I mean, the Romans came close to giving up, but they had Vespasian, the general, found a deserter who told them how to get in through a secret passageway, and some Romans infiltrated at night, killed guards, opened the gates. The Romans came in, started slaughtering everybody. Josephus, in the meantime, he held out in a cave. He was hidden in a cave with 30 other survivors. All right, let's see what this question is. What did they use to build up the walls? Look, I guess they used stones. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert on the engineering of the time, but it's a good question. Anyway, the Josephus was with 30 other men hiding in a cave. They had a murder-suicide pact. The idea was they drew lots as to who killed who and when, and in the end, Josephus and one other person were left alive, and the idea was that they were supposed to kill each other or kill themselves. And Josephus persuaded this other person, let's go over, to the Romans. Let's try to live. And he persuaded the Romans that he could be useful to them. So they let him live. And he became a kind of Jewish Benedict Arnold. And also, of course, a well-known chronicler of the conflict. And as Zach has explained, he was also an explainer of Judaism to the Roman non-Jewish world. So at the same time, he was doing this ticklish dance where at the same time he was arguing, showing his loyalty to Rome. At the same time, he was trying to stand up for the honor of his Jewish heritage. I think there might be another question here. Zach, you seeing anything? Let me see. What?
Says,
all right. The
I'm just gonna read.
suicide idea seems fishy since it's repeated in Masada, and now we know that there was no suicide in Masada. Well, I don't know anything of the sort.
Leold, where do you get your sources?
Look, I it's not. We know the exact story that came down to us comes from Josephus. How could he know, for example, the speech of Ben Eleazar, the leader of the rebels in Masada? So there's some creative writing that went on then, but we don't know that this wasn't a mass suicide. In fact, I think it likely was. And
Ralph, may I add something quickly? This
sure.
is related to Josephus being, locked up in the dungeon and then pursuing one of his competitors, which you have mentioned already. By the way, Josephus actually stumbled across a math theory because the way that he did it is he had calculated so that him and his companion are the only ones that survive by saying every second person should kill the person next to them. And that's right now a math problem that's called Josephus law, by the way. So just look it up.
Well, okay, that's interesting. I don't know anything about that, but that would be a good explanation of how that worked out.
Correct.
Anyway, we know he went over to the Roman side. We know he was a chronicler of the conflict. We know he was an explainer of Judaism to the Romans. We'll get to Masada a little later. In the meantime, we haven't even arrived at the final battle of Jerusalem. So Vespasian reconquered the Galilee and most of the land of Israel up to the gates of Jerusalem. Then he withdrew and waited out most of the year 69 CE. 69 CE was an interesting year in Roman history. It's known as the year of the four emperors. This was right after the death of Nero. I believe Nero was assassinated. And there were, in succession, four people who became emperor during that year. These were people who had various, who claimed the throne. And one by one, they managed to lose the throne and their lives in the process. Now, but Vespasian, for some reason, it's not clear to me why, but the Roman army of the Rhine favored Vespasian to be emperor. And in the end, the Roman army of the Rhine triumphed in this war of the four emperors. And they invited Vespasian to take the throne in Rome. Vespasian was waiting this out. I think he was waiting in Alexandria, and he got word, and so he went to Rome in triumph to become the new emperor. In the meantime, he left command of the army in Judea / Palestine to his son Titus. Now, Titus had distinguished himself in this war under the overall command of his father, taking a force which cleared out a number of rebel concentrations in the Judean countryside, while Vespasian remained at the head of the main army. So Titus had some experience as a general.
Ralph, did you mention the most important part of the Josephus prediction? When he was at Japata, and obviously Vespasian imprisoned Josephus. And what happened is Josephus predicted that, please don't kill me, because I actually predict.
Oh, you're going to become the emperor.
Well, but even before that, Josephus, when he was fighting for Japata, said only on the 40th day he would be able to enter Japata. Up until then, I'll be able to defend it. And Vespasian, exactly on the 40th day, entered Japata, and that's how he basically thought of the Josephus as somebody who can, an oracle, predict stuff like that. And he became an emperor according to Josephus because he predicted it. Because if you think of it, Vespasian was actually disliked by Nero. The reason is Nero was a musician, or as he claimed to be. He actually played the flute, and he would sit all of his generals in the audience. And Vespasian was one of the generals, and he fell asleep during the Nero's. And because of that, the Judea was considered to be a Siberia of where you don't want to go. They were pretty rebellious, and no generals,
right,
to go there.
It wasn't a it certainly was not going to be a peaceful and happy kind of generalship and of course the Jews were thought of as largely ungovernable and very tough. You're right. You're right with all of this. This is very pertinent.
To the old, there was actually remainders found next to Japata of a small pygmy. Every Roman soldier or legionnaire used to take a small pig with them because they have to eat during the campaign, and they would raise those pigs and then they slaughter them. Obviously, Jews were not allowed to eat pigs, so that's how we know that they found a bunch of bones of a small pygmies around the area of Japata.
Piglets.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, piglets.
Yes, and it was Jotapata. Yes.
Correct.
All right. So where was I?
Titus. You were talking about Titus.
Yes, Titus. Actually, a very interesting turn. Let me see if I wrote this down in my notes. Oh, yeah, I do have this. Okay. The Jews in Jerusalem had a government. They minted coins. You come to the coin slide. Yeah, that's it. Okay. It's interesting. These coins were actually discovered recently. The coins that they found from the first revolt, they were minted and inscribed for the freedom of Zion or the deliverance of Zion, and they were often dated year 1 of the deliverance of Zion, year 2 of the deliverance of Zion, year 3. This was a very self-conscious and functioning government that the Jews had set up in Jerusalem. As the Romans swept through the countryside, overwhelming the Galilee and elsewhere, surviving radical messianic rebels came to Jerusalem alongside other refugees, swelling its population to 250,000, which was about 10 times its normal size and about twice its size during the 3 pilgrimage holidays. The pilgrimage holidays were Passover, Sukkot, with Passover in the spring, Sukkot in the fall, and Shavuot also in the spring, later in the spring. Anyway, so the population would swell to 5 times its normal size during the pilgrimage holidays. In this instance, because of those refugees, it was 10 times the normal size, to 250,000. And these rebels outmaneuvered and overwhelmed the wealthy class that dominated the government in Jerusalem. And they executed the high priest Ananus, not to be confused with another high priest with a similar name, who was similarly executed in the year 66 by radical Jewish rebels. This high priest Ananus had served as the government's head of state. Then 3 rebel factions went to war against each other, even destroying a grain storage facility as they fought. even though they knew full well that the Romans would soon be upon them. These were fanatics. They were imbued with a messianic fervor. And probably each of them thought that their leader, their charismatic leader, would be the Messiah. The Jewish concept of a Messiah is not how we understand Jesus. It was not a prince of peace, but a warrior prince, who would lead the people in liberation against foreign rule. That was the Jewish conception of Messiah. Miraculously, when the Romans came, however, they coalesced these three factions to defend the city. When Titus rode ahead of his army with a small cavalry guard to study Jerusalem's defenses, his party was suddenly attacked by Jewish fighters who came within a few feet of either killing or capturing the new Roman commander, who happened to be also the son of the new emperor and a future emperor himself. One wonders, what if they had killed him? What if they had captured him? The Jewish defense of Jerusalem was aggressive. It mostly consisted of surprise attacks by Jews springing from the city through hidden sally ports, with Romans suffering repeated tactical defeats. But the Romans, being Romans, kept on coming. The siege lasted over 4 months in the year 70. The Jews defended 3 defensive walls, with the second and third walls fortified with high towers. After breaching the first wall, the Romans actually suffered another defeat when the Jews literally undermined the great siege machine that the Romans employed, digging a tunnel underneath the siege machine, between the first wall and the second wall, igniting flammable materials and causing the tunnel to cave in, taking the Roman machine with them and recapturing the space they had lost. And later, even with hunger sapping their physical strength, the Jews fought the Romans to exhaustion in head-to-head massed formations at the Temple Mount. Let's take a look at the temple again, the model of the temple. Yes. So what we have up here is the Temple Mount with these 2 courtyards. There's a lot of open space. Picture these as battlegrounds. Their defense broke only when a lone Roman legionnaire threw a small burning piece of wood, which found its mark in a room rife with timber, olive oil, and other flammable materials. The Jews were unable to both fight the spreading flames and defend against the Romans, and so the temple fell. Jewish resistance. I want to say, by the way, that once the Romans kept on coming, it was pretty inevitable that they were going to win. But so it didn't have to happen in this way. But this is what happened. The Jewish resistance in the city ended altogether 3 weeks later, and the Romans sacked the city mercilessly, killing tens of thousands and enslaving almost everyone else. 3 or 4 Jewish strongholds remained, in the country, with the last being Masada, whose story most of you probably know, which fiercely resisted a long siege and then chose to die by their own hands rather than be subjected to slavery as the Romans were about to overwhelm them. 60 years after this catastrophe, it is all the more remarkable that the Jews of Judea and environs again rose up against the Romans, retook Jerusalem, and held out for another 3 years with a new revolutionary government under Bar Kokhba, proclaimed to be the Messiah by the renowned rabbinical sage Akiva, only to meet the same kind of catastrophe years, in the end. We don't know quite the same kind of detail about the second rebellion that we know about the first. Sometimes I wonder how different Jewish history might have been if the Jews in the first rebellion had a single talented leader like Bar Kokhba. In other words, if there had been a unified command without faction fighting, without civil war, led by a talented general like Bar Kokhba. Or if the Jews had listened to the Roman offers to surrender, as conveyed at least 3 times by Josephus outside of Jerusalem's walls. I mean, they had Josephus come up to the walls and actually, shout the terms that the Romans were offering, in their language, Aramaic. Would the Jews have had a more normal trajectory as a nation with ancient roots in the same land? And would this have meant that the Jews would not have produced the spiritual and intellectual genius associated with the Jews as a minority living on suffrage among others? Then again, is it valid to assume that the great intellectual and artistic achievements of the Jewish people, as represented by the huge disproportion of Nobel Prizes won by Jews, about 22% of the total of individual prizes between 1901 and 2021. My thinking is that, and my question is, does the fact of Jewish marginal minority existence have something to do with unique culture of this marginalized minority that values thought and study as much as it does? I mean, that's quite a remarkable figure. 22% of the total of individual Nobel Prizes awarded to Jews, who constitute 0.2% of the world's population. Anyway, these are rhetorical questions we can't really answer, but they may provide us with food for thought. Now, let's take a look at the chat here. What else is going on?
I can give you a question, Ralph.
Go
Did you
ahead.
know where the Roman camp was? And Roman had a camp in every campaign.
Yes.
Go ahead.
What? Is the question, where's the Roman camp? Where? When? What?
Outside of Jerusalem.
Well, it was outside of Jerusalem. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah.
And the Romans, they eventually, surrounded Jerusalem. So they built fortifications all around Jerusalem. I'm sure they probably had more than one camp. I mean, they had several legions engaged in the campaign, plus auxiliary forces.
Interesting. No, this was a question from the chat actually, but if anybody has any more questions, please either raise your hand or drop it here. Again, Ralph, I guess, would you describe the pain and agony, particularly when Romans attacked the temple itself? There was a strange account of women throwing their children into the Roman arms and dying of hunger, and it was complete mayhem.
Yeah. I'll describe a lot of this. In the end, the food gave out. So there was famine and illness. The revolutionary, the government, to a certain extent, tried to hoard food for the soldiers, giving priority to the soldiers. There were tales of cannibalism. This is what kind of happens in times of famine and, dire apocalyptic times. And the reports of famine, from the time of the Donner Party going out west here in the 1840s, in Ukraine during the killer famine that Stalin imposed on the so-called kulaks, the so-called rich peasants.
It's called Holodomor.
Yes, they have a name for their Holocaust. Yes.
Yeah.
At the end, there were reports of a gathering of Jews on the Temple Mount grounds. There's burning all around. The Romans have broken through. There's widespread mayhem. They're killing everybody. They're standing on the parapet somewhere. These families, and they're really expecting the wrath of God at this point. They're expecting God's intervention in a really concrete way. And they had faith up until that point that, in fact, God was going to intervene and destroy the Romans, or smite the Romans, as we might say in biblical language. It didn't happen. Most of them perished by fire. There were Jews who tried to bribe their way out of the city. Some were allowed to live as slaves. Others were let go. A few others were let go. There's also the story of Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was a rabbinic sage of the time, and his disciples put him in a coffin. They kind of smuggled him out, and he told the Romans, "Look, I'm not here to oppose you, but it's in your interest to let me live and establish a rabbinical academy, which would refocus the Jewish religion on study and allow Roman rule to proceed." And the Romans agreed and allowed him to set up the academy, the famous rabbinical academy at Yavne. Now, there was a really good book about the period between the first and second rebellions. It's in the form of a novel, but it's researched. It's called As a Driven Leaf by Milton Steinberg. Milton Steinberg was a conservative / Reconstructionist rabbi. He wrote this in the 1950s. And it gives you a pretty good picture of life in Judea / Palestine. Please look the name. The name of the book is As a Driven Leaf. As a Driven Leaf. And the author is Milton Steinberg. Probably pretty easy to remember or to write down. Yes, As a Driven Leaf, Milton Steinberg. Maybe you can silence the sound. Yeah, I mean, these are good scenes. It was a grand place. The pool of water that you saw, it wasn't a swimming pool. It would have been a place where the high priest would bathe after and before going into the Holy of Holies, which is the central part of the temple. In biblical times, the Holy of Holies was where God was supposed to live. He was supposed to actually dwell there. And there was this prescribed ritual which the high priest would follow, especially on Yom Kippur. He would enter the Holy of Holies to atone for the entire nation. And, there was a lot of incense because, he could not see the face of God and live. So that's what the incense was about.
It's called mikvah.
Yeah, the pool, the place where somebody would bathe, where the priest would bathe, right. It's called a mikvah. Yes.
So somebody just had a question. How long did it take to build a second temple? Do you remember by any chance?
Oh, I don't know, but certainly years. It might have been even 10 or 20 years. Well. First of all, the first version of the second temple goes from Ezra and Nehemiah's time, from the time of the return of the Jews from the Babylonian exile, which was several hundred years before. And Herod, at least doubled the size, perhaps even more than that, and made it much grander. And he was using all of the architectural and engineering skills that the Greco-Roman world knew, which the more ancient world from a few hundred years before did not know.
So I want to play one more video. As I've mentioned, Herod the Great tomb was found due to the Josephus Flavius kind of mapping it out through his writing. So I'm going to play a video showing the remains or archaeological remains in the Israeli museum.
This is another important finding over here in the land of Israel. This is the tomb of King Herod the Great, the one who ordered to kill 2,000 children under 2 years old when Jesus was born. This tomb over here was found on spot in Herodian, a national park that it's a must to visit when in Israel. This is how the palace and the burial tomb of King David looked like 2,000 years ago. Built on top of a Herodian, an artificial mountain done by King Herod the Great. And you can see it all over in Jerusalem. Look how the tomb was built. And I'm going to show you what was found of that tomb, of that mausoleum. So this is the tomb that was found on spot. A Roman bath, a luxurious one. This section over here is dealing with Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus Christ.
It's the Israeli Museum with Israeli Archaeological Museum. That's what it's called.
I'm not familiar with that museum.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, there's interesting, like if you go to Istanbul, allegedly killed those children, Zahar. Oh my God. Okay, well, this is another.
Yeah, well, we have a right to be skeptical about lots that's in the Bible, whether in the Hebrew Bible or in the New Testament. And also, of course, we have to be aware that a lot of people take it very seriously and literally, and we want to respect everybody's beliefs.
Kathy, you have something to say?
Oh, about the alleged children being killed. Yeah, I just want to say that if something, this is just me, I'm not trying to knock anybody else's beliefs. However, if King Herod had slaughtered 3,000 babies, I think there would be a historical record of it. I don't know. That's just me.
Is that it? I'm not that familiar with the New Testament. Is that in the New Testament, or is that something that's not exactly in the Scripture? Do you know?
Okay, it's in the Christian Bible. It's in the Gospels, in the New Testament. There's nothing about it in the Old Testament, and I don't know that there's any historical record of such an atrocity being committed by this king. And the only place that I'm aware of that it's recorded is in the Christian New Testament. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Now Herod did do some really bad things, but the Hasmonean kings, the Hasmonean family that he replaced, which he sort of murdered, murdered out of existence, married into and murdered out of existence. did some pretty terrible things too, really terrible things. And by the way, you won't see references to either the Hasmoneans or to Herod in the Hebrew Bible, although these were Jewish kings. You know, for one thing, the rabbis didn't think they were particularly legitimate because these were not kings in the line of David. You know, they were not from the old Davidic line of the old United Kingdom and then the Kingdom of Judah. But also, these were kings who went to war and massacred many thousands of people who were ideologically the ancestors of the rabbis. That you know, rabbinical Judaism became mainstream Judaism, you know, after the destruction of the temple and you know, in later centuries.
Right. And also the places to gather were called synagogues. And
Right. And you know, the main focus of worship during the time of the temple was the temple. And the main form of worship was animal sacrifice and grain offerings. You know, it's a very ancient kind of religion. You know, once that was gone, then this new kind of religion took over, which had to do with communal prayer and study. Kind of a revolutionary, you know, it's not how the ancients worshiped their gods, you know, whether they were polytheists or monotheists.
Correct. Yeah. This is definitely interesting. Anybody else have anything to add? Or
I just looked it up online in the Bible. It says that Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked, the wise men became furious and sent all the male children in Bethlehem all to that region. It was over 2 years. So it doesn't actually say a number, but it says he did it.
82 years, you said?
Yeah, under 2 years, sorry.
Under 2 years.
Any baby
under 2 years, babies under 2 years of age. I mean, children under 2 years of age, right. Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's a scriptural reference in the New Testament.
Matthew,
you know, which is something I've just learned.
Yeah.
You know, I have a St. James Bible, but it's in such small print that I've never read it. You know.
That's a good excuse.
It's a very good excuse for this.
I have a Quran
for this good Jewish boy.
but I don't have the magnifying glass.
No, you know, my magnifying glasses don't work for that. Okay.
If you're going to read Christian scripture, I would recommend that you not read the King James Version.
Okay.
It's all these and thous and
yes, that's right.
It's Old English.
Yes, that's Jamesian kind of English.
Yeah, James the First.
Yeah, right. It's Elizabethan kind of English. Yes,
correct.
We have a question suggestion here. So again, Ralph, somebody, you know, Casper says, thank you, great presentation. I have a question. If anyone is interested in learning more about this period of history, what books do you recommend to look further into? I guess Josephus Flavius will be one, right?
Well,
the Jewish Wars.
Yeah, well, you know, Josephus had his own axes to grind, of course. You know, he wasn't a modern historian. He was, you know, what I mainly used is one particular book. I don't know how accessible it is, but it has a simple title. It's called Apocalypse, and it's by Neil Faulkner. Neil, Neil, and Faulkner, F like in Frank, Aulk, N like in Nancy, ER. The subtitle of Apocalypse is The Great Jewish Revolt Against Rome, AD 66 to 73.
So I just wanted to add a little bit on the construction of the temple. So when Herod, as we know, he was an Idumean, right? Or at least he's
Yes, he was well, yeah, that's his ancestry, yeah.
It's a convert to Judaism. They were not Jewish
Well,
initially.
his father was the convert.
Right. His father was a convert. But he was, as you know, as a new convert, he was pretty zealous to prove himself. And when he was building a temple, the people that were not religious were not allowed to go into the temple, and even the construction workers, the plumbers, the masons, they were supposed to be extremely religious. And in fact, if you're not religious to a level that they need to be, orthodoxy level, then you as a construction worker are not allowed to go in. So that was the extent of him being very zealous and wholly blessed the place, so to speak, according to the Jewish rabbinical laws.
Okay. Herod did this dance. On the one hand, he was trying to build up his Jewish cred, his credibility as a Jew.
Right.
On the other hand, he had lots of non-Jewish subjects, as well as Jews, and he had his Roman overlords to satisfy.
Right.
So at one point, I think it was Herod who did this rather than any of his successors. He had a Roman eagle standard that stood in proximity to the temple. I don't know that it was on the temple grounds, but religious Jews, traditional Jews, were offended by that because the Roman standards were these pagan symbols. Sometimes the Roman legionnaires would sacrifice to their standards. They'd sort of worship them. So he would do things like that. I don't have I don't remember other stories of that.
His famous port was called Caesarea,
and in honor of the Caesar, the emperor.
Caesar, and it was a cosmopolitan Roman city.
Yeah, it was not a Jewish city.
It was not a Jewish city whatsoever.
No.
And also, somebody was talking about the assimilation of Jews, even pre-Roman time. They said that during the Ptolemy, who was one of the Diadoches of the Alexander the Great. Diadoches, the generals Alexander the Great.
Yeah. This is Ptolemy. I mean, the P is silent. This is Ptolemy.
Ptolemy.
Yeah.
So basically, there was four generals that Cassander, Ptolemy. Then you had a general that Seleucid, and another general more in the Anatolia area. But during the time Seleucid, Ptolemy fought together. Ptolemy ended up taking the area of where the Jerusalem is, and current day Israel. And to make a long story short, a lot of the Jews really were assimilated. They said out of the four names of the kids that the Jewish were named, there was three of them were either Alexander, Cassander, or something in that nature. So therefore, the Jewish name was only one out of the four.
Yeah, as you go through history, for example, the Hasmoneans, who were very devout Jews who rebelled against the Seleucid Syrian Greeks in the name of Judaism. If you look at their line of succession, within 1 to 2 generations, they all have Greek names.
Right.
And it didn't mean that they weren't still Jews, but they were very affected by the Jewish culture, the Greek culture around them. It was a kind of an accommodation. It was a form of assimilation.
And in fact, just to prove the point, the Alexandria in Egypt, which was a Greek town, was 25% populated by Jews during those times.
Yes. Well, I cited that statistic of that in the first century of the Common Era, at various times, there's an estimate of 7 to 8 million Jews living in the empire, which constituted between 6 and 9% of the total population.
Right.
There was a lot of tension. There were a lot of times of conflict. It's interesting that in between the two great rebellions, the one of 66 to 73 and the one later on led by Bar Kokhba, which was approximately 132 to 135, there were massive Jewish rebellions elsewhere in the empire, on I believe it was Crete. So sometimes I wonder whether it was Cyprus, but I think it was Crete. There was a massive rebellion also in Alexandria.
Right.
Hundreds of thousands of people were killed on both sides.
Right. And just to also prove the point, during the Caligula time, there was a Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria. His name is Philo,
yeah.
And so he ended up heading to Alexandria to tell Caligula that, listen, we are having issues with all these Greeks. Can you help us? 20% of the town, and the words he used, quote unquote, they're about to throw us into the water because that's where the Nile was. And Caligula said, "Who the hell are these people? I don't know. Throw them out." Basically, we know Caligula as being the most, initially was selected by Rome as his name meant boots, small sandals, and he was very, very well loved by people initially, and then became a sycophantic, orgy-oriented human emperor.
Yeah, he was all too human, right? If there's nothing else, we should probably call it a day. Thanks for listening. I hope I was useful to you. It wasn't easy to put this stuff together, so I hope you got something out of it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I hope we'll do it again, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Most importantly, if you had fun, so that's the most important thing. If you had fun through this, and people enjoyed your presentation, that's the most important thing. A two-way street.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kathy, for that. Okay, goodbye, everybody. Good night.
Bye. Good night.
All right.